Good morning and welcome to the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation's annual economic forecast. I'm Frank Motek, your money news anchor on KNX 1070 News Radio, host of Motek on Money, and your MC for the first portion of this program. This is our first virtual forecast event. It's an honor to be part of it. And it's an honor now to welcome to the virtual stage the chair of the LAEDC Board of Governors, Steve Nissen.
Thank you. As Frank said, my name is Steve Nissen, and I have the honor of being the chair of the LAEDC this year. You will hear a lot today the words equity and inclusion. That is purposeful. The LAEDC believes this is not a passing aspiration, but is mission critical. The events of the past year have laid bare the inequities of both the national and local economies. The lived experiences of the millions of Americans who have found themselves unemployed during the pandemic are a stark contrast to the record-setting levels of Wall Street. And while there's still so much left to do, the LAEDC has been making strides to address these inequities within our region. For the past 5 years, we've partnered with our community college system to connect faculty with industry, to improve the way that students are prepared for the well-paying occupations we know will be hiring in the near future. Our business assistance team is helping entrepreneurs of color and thousands of small businesses with one-to-one consulting and resources, including grants. Our community connectory resource page was one of the first in the region and has served over 100,000 people with multilingual resources, just demonstrating the reach. Our industry councils and research are informing policy priorities that will create jobs and make our industries more competitive. And we've been intentional about encouraging diversity and equity in these programs. Building on that commitment, today we'll focus on what we're calling a tale of two recoveries, with assessments of how we can collectively support an equitable recovery that lifts those most impacted in our communities by the pandemic, which will lead to a better Los Angeles for all of us. The CEO of the LAEDC, Bill Allen, will now provide some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Steve, so much for the kind introduction, for your leadership as chair of the LAEDC, and for all your years of support for our mission. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first ever virtual version of our annual LAEDC economic forecast. If you attended last year's forecast, you may remember that we told you a full month before any stay-at-home orders were issued that the looming threat of the coronavirus, then mostly impacting Asia, could soon become a force that would finally cool off our 10 years of consecutive economic growth and record low unemployment we had reached last February. But of course, none of us then realized just how severely our economy and our lives would be impacted. That's because such exogenous shocks to our economy are very hard to predict, and the course they take is also extremely difficult to forecast. But this year, as we have for the last 15, we will again provide our most carefully considered and data-driven outlook for the future course of our economy. Our forecast this year is subtitled A Tale of Two Recoveries, because the recovery that is underway is bifurcated along a number of lines. Wall Street has fully recovered, and equity markets have reached new heights, while Main Street is still devastated by small business closures and massive layoffs. Those with at least four-year college degrees sustained relatively modest and shorter-term job losses when compared with those with only a high school education or less, who experienced very high unemployment rates and are on a much slower and longer recovery path. My colleague Shannon Sedgwick will share more on those dichotomies in her presentation. And then you'll hear from Amy Liu and Bruce Katz, two of our nation's foremost experts on metropolitan economies like ours. We've asked them to share their insights on inclusive economic recovery, as that must be our collective focus in the years ahead. We've had terrible inequities in our society and in our economy before this pandemic, but they've been brought into very sharp relief by this pandemic. Addressing them is the primary focus of the LAEDC these days, and informing and encouraging all of you to join us in the quest for a truly inclusive economic recovery is the goal of today's forecast event. Events like this don't happen without sponsors who share our sense of urgency to help all our neighbors participate in the recovery. So please join me in thanking each of our sponsors today. Our presenting sponsor is the Los Angeles Orange County Regional Consortium of Community Colleges, with whom we operate our Center for a Competitive Workforce, which has never been more fundamentally necessary to our future than at this moment when the nature of work is changing so dramatically, and our colleges are working hard to adapt their curriculum and training programs to meet the moment. I want to acknowledge our good friend Alex Davis, who leads that consortium, for her support and partnership today and throughout the year. I'd also like to thank our platinum sponsor, Citi, and their remarkable leaders in this market, Holly Bazadi and James Alva, who've been so dedicated to our mission and supporting equity and inclusion in our economy since long before this pandemic. And let's also thank our 4 gold sponsors: Amazon Web Services, CTBC Bank, the Latino Restaurant Association, and the Watson Land Company. During the forecast today, we hope you will all join our conversation on social media using the hashtag LAEconomy. The past year has been a tough one, with 400,000 of our LA County neighbors who lost their jobs to the pandemic in the spring still unable to regain their employment here. Thousands of our small businesses have closed permanently, and thousands more are on the brink. And the pandemic has been hardest on those of our neighbors who are people of color, women, younger Angelenos, and lower wage workers, as they have been disproportionately represented in our service industries, most severely impacted by the restrictive public health orders. These folks were the least able to withstand a loss of income, and yet have faced the highest rates of unemployment. And don't get me started on digital equity. Hundreds of thousands of Angelenos have no access to affordable high-speed internet here in Los Angeles County. So they were unable to continue their studies from home or seek retraining for a job of the future when schools and colleges closed their campuses. They were unable to continue working from home when their shops or offices were ordered to close. And they were unable to access telehealth services to deal with medical conditions or pandemic-induced depression or anxiety. And most recently, they are unable to even make an online appointment to be vaccinated. If we're going to have an equitable recovery into a 21st century economy, ever more dependent on online commerce, we simply must connect everyone to the internet. As civic stewards and leaders, we believe we must choose to pursue the path of equitable recovery. It's not the only path to recovery. It's not necessarily the easiest path to recovery, but it is the right path, and it will ultimately provide us with the greatest returns. If we don't make the conscious choices and the related investments, we will end up on vastly divergent paths, with many of us still able to experience the California dream, but many more of us seeing it slip away from their grasp. Shannon's presentation this morning will shed further light on all this, but I also direct you to our website at laedc.org, where you will find our full forecast report and another important report called Pathways for Economic Resiliency, which we have just produced for the Los Angeles County Department of Workforce Development, Aging, and Community Services. It was just released last week by the LA County Board of Supervisors, whose chair, Hilda Solis, also immediately introduced a formal motion to advance the recommendations offered in the report. It has received significant coverage from the press as it contains detailed data and insights on the effects of the pandemic on our region's people, industries, and jobs, and a data-driven series of recommendations for pathways forward. We'll be sharing some of those today and asking you to engage and discuss what we can each do to help move the needle on the ambitious goal of a recovery that lifts all Angelenos. You're seeing a couple of slides that briefly summarize the 8 key recommendations. Some are focused on training and connecting dislocated workers to well-paying jobs that will be hiring in the future. Others entail asking businesses to prioritize equitable hiring practices and to connect with the colleges in their area or our Center for a Competitive Workforce to create stronger talent pipelines, work-based learning opportunities, and pathways to well-paying jobs for those who've historically faced barriers to employment. And speaking of barriers to employment, again, we do need to connect our neighbors who don't have high-speed internet to the infrastructure, hardware, affordable rate plans, and digital literacy training they need to be part of the 21st century economy. We also need to expand access to childcare so more people have the ability to work. We must support our entrepreneurs of color and their businesses with low-interest loans, cash grants, rental assistance, technical assistance, export assistance, procurement opportunities, and more. Beyond these ideas, we look forward to listening closely to the ideas and perspectives of all of our speakers and panelists today. And we look forward to working with you to refine and implement the best of all these ideas for our region to advance a more robust, equitable, sustainable, and resilient economy that provides a healthy and high standard of living for all. I'd now like to hand this virtual mic over to our partner in much of this work and our presenting sponsor of this year's economic forecast, the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Economic and Workforce Development in Educational Services at Rancho Santiago Community College District and the Executive Director of the Los Angeles Orange County Regional Consortium of Community Colleges, our good friend, Alex Davis.
Good morning, Bill, and thank you so much. Thank you for this platform, and good morning, everyone. We are a part of 7 regional consortia in the state of California. Our region is comprised of 29 community college institutions, that's 28 community colleges, and 1 standalone continuing education center. Our vision for the regional consortium is to create a culture of completion, transfer a career-ready workforce among our member college students. And we do that by leveraging partnerships such as LAEDC, our workforce development boards, our economic and development agencies, and many business and industry partners that are critical to helping us develop the resources to set our students up for success. With the Strong Workforce Program investments, which legislation was enacted in 2016, the purpose of this funding is to really get our workforce on a pathway and a journey to self-sufficiency. And that means getting them into living wage careers and beyond that. And the goal was to create middle-skilled workers in the tune of 1 million at the onset of the Strong Workforce investments. And as you can see, our community colleges have received about $137 million in Strong Workforce investments since the 2016-17 allocation. And now the local education agencies, the K-12 partners, have received about $112.9 million of those investments. And our regional consortium is hosted at Rancho Santiago Community College District, and the California Community College Chancellor's Office uses the regional consortium to pass those funds to the member colleges, which develop regional projects that are relevant to the needs and demands of our employer partners across many different sectors. Those investments are not only impacting the strong workforce legislation, but also impacting the progress for students, completion for students, making sure our students are transitioning from career pathways into the careers for which they have studied. We are not only training our students, but we are also responsible for working with intermediaries such as LAEDC and Unite LA and our regional directors of employer engagement to make sure students are making the transition from the classroom into gainful employment. And so I want to thank our 15 district leaders, our chancellors and superintendent presidents. We serve about 40% of the students across the state of California that are enrolled in the colleges. I would like to thank the team at the LAOCRC office. We have Dr. Audrey Childers, who is our LA director. She works directly with our colleges and our deans and faculty who really do the hard work and are in the trenches to make sure projects are relevant to business and industry. And if you need to contact us and get more information about how you can partner, our colleges serve as the premier training provider for most of our partners in industry. And we want to continue to keep a focus on economic recovery and help those who have been disenfranchised or need short-term training. We have very flexible programs, 19 colleges in LA, and we have 9 colleges in Orange County and 1 standalone continuing education center. And we're set up to be flexible in this time of disruption with the pandemic, which really provides opportunity for us to really just pivot and help those who are in need of retooling and upskilling to get back into the workplace. And the next slide is our contact information. Contact either Dr. Childer, who is our director in LA, or you can contact Dr. Chamorro, who is our director in Orange County. And Bill, I want to thank you again for your leadership and your team for making significant contribution to the strong workforce initiatives that we have in LA. And at this time, we're going to turn it back over to our wonderful MC, Frank Motek.
The forecast event today includes a tale of two recoveries. The good news in all this, recovery is on following the once unthinkable events of the past year in which virtually the entire economy was shut down because of the pandemic. Delighted now to be able to introduce the director of the Institute and author of many of the most insightful reports. Please join me now in welcoming Shannon Sedgwick.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy in the new year. Thank you for joining us for our annual LAEDC forecast as we look forward to what is in store for our state and local economy. This time last year, we anticipated slow but continued economic growth. And 12 months later, we're wondering how long it will take to recover from the almost immediate pandemic-induced recession. COVID-19 shook the global economy in 2020 and forced us to reassess many economic fundamentals. The rapid onset of the pandemic and the severity of the measures taken to mitigate the spread of the virus have forced governments to rapidly enact unprecedented relief bills for individuals and businesses alike. Before getting straight into the numbers, I'm going to touch briefly on the challenges of forecasting during a pandemic. Afterwards, we'll dive into our economic forecasts for the state, and we'll conclude with a look at some of the disparate effects of the pandemic. Whether forecasting raw inputs and supply chain processing, stock prices for tech indices, or unemployment in the United States, statistical processes were entirely thrown for a loop as a result of the pandemic's exogenous effects. While we have a better understanding of COVID-19 now, as opposed to a year ago, the science behind forecasting is still off kilter. A forecast is decomposed into three parts: trend, seasonality, and noise, all of which come together to form the end result. COVID-19 affected all three parts, changing past trends and seasonalities, as well as creating an immense amount of noise. And while I won't bore you with all of the sordid details of our forecasting model, I will share that it is hard to accurately determine new trends without a historical basis in which the model can learn from. Additionally, government policy can greatly affect the recovery speed, and the speed at which policy has been implemented in response to the pandemic has been expedient, to say the least. Data lags and reliability issues also pose major problems, especially when economic impacts such as employment are ever changing, as are public health orders that businesses must follow. All of these factors have resulted in economic forecasts varying widely from institution to institution. The forecast we're presenting today assumes that vaccine distribution will continue at its current pace and that interpersonal activities resume in Q3 of this year. Now that we covered our major assumptions, let's dive into our economic outlook for California through 2022. California had some of the strictest coronavirus regulations in the nation. Approximately 8.75% of Californians have tested positive for COVID-19. Per capita, San Bernardino County leads the way, followed by Riverside and Los Angeles counties, all with over 1,000 cases per 10,000 residents. Los Angeles County and its 10 million residents has more than 1 million confirmed cases, the most in any state nationwide. While daily COVID-19 cases are decreasing statewide, the next thing to watch for are other variants of the virus. Officials have expressed concern regarding the rising dominance of the UK variant, which spreads 50% faster. This variant has already been detected statewide in San Diego, Los Angeles, Orange County, San Bernardino, Alameda, San Mateo, and Yolo. The good news, the current vaccines appear to be effective against this strain. The bad news, they appear to be less effective against the South African variant. This strain hasn't been detected in California yet, but it has the potential to inhibit the brewing economic recovery if it is resistant to the currently developed vaccines. The stay-at-home order issued by Gavin Newsom on March 19th and the safer-at-home order issued for Los Angeles County on March 20th stopped non-essential activities in response to COVID-19. Restrictions and mandated closures led to unprecedented job losses in March and April. The reopening process began in May, and jobs were being added to payrolls again. However, spikes in the number of cases in July and late November led to reinstated restrictions, and employment once again faltered. As of December, just over half of the 2.5 million jobs lost in California in the months of March and April have returned, and close to 45% of the 716,000 jobs lost in Los Angeles County have been recovered. California's unemployment rose sharply from 3.9% in February to a peak of 16.4% in the months of April and May of 2020. Revenue losses and job losses were almost immediate. If you compare the current COVID-19 recession to the 2001 dot-com recession and the Great Recession, you can see that unemployment typically changes gradually over time in recessions related to the business cycle. Los Angeles County experienced a dramatic spike in unemployment directly after the safer-at-home orders were put into place. Unemployment improved after the immediate shock, but rates remain historically high. Real GDP growth in California dropped by 0.6% in 2020. That's down from 3.4% in 2019. The LAEDC expects this reduction in growth to continue, with real GDP growth forecasted at 2% for 2021 and 1.3% for the following year. LA County growth declined by 3% in 2020, but is expected to grow faster than the state at 2.8% in 2021 and 4.2% in 2022. Economic recovery should bring the unemployment rate in California from 10.4% in 2020 down to 9.4% in 2021 and 7.8% by the end of 2022. It's assuming the virus-related shocks are behind us. LA County is also expected to see a significant decline in its unemployment rate as leisure and hospitality industries resume their normal operations. In 2020, California's 39 million residents received increased unemployment benefits and economic stimulus payments, leading to a rise in personal income. Our forecast does not account for these increased benefits in 2021, and thus we show a decline in personal income. In subsequent years, personal income will rise once again as the California and Los Angeles economy recovers. Looking ahead, a major portion of economic growth statewide and in the Southern California region will come from the sectors hardest hit, including trade, transportation, and utilities, and leisure and hospitality. Sectors that face the most restrictions and closure mandates shed the most jobs in 2020. And these industries, as restrictions ease and they come back online, will be the ones adding workers back to their payrolls in order to accommodate activity closer to the pre-pandemic norm. For example, as restaurants are allowed to resume on-site indoor dining, they'll require wait staff in order to provide their service. Job growth in trade, transportation, and utilities will be driven by gains in retail trade and passenger-related transportation, which flatlined during the pandemic, like cruise lines and air travel. Some industries like information, which includes the motion picture and television industry, are expected to grow in the Southern California region, while they are expected to decline in other areas of the state. And manufacturing is expected to add jobs in Los Angeles County while losing jobs statewide. California housing has been a major topic in our past few annual forecasts, and it earns its spot again this year. In 2019, the median list price for a home in the state was $567,000. That's 82% higher than the US as a whole. In fact, it's the highest in the nation behind the state of Hawaii. Less than 55% of California residents are homeowners, and that's 10% less than the national rate of 66%. Plagued by zoning issues, NIMBY mindsets, high demand, and no supply, Southern California boasts an even higher median list price of $726,000. That's 28% over that statewide median. Demographic trends show that people are moving. A population for the County of Los Angeles has decreased the past 3 years and is projected to decrease for the Southern California region and state as a whole in the coming years, per the California Department of Finance demographics team. For many California residents, rent is eating up a major portion of their income. A rent burden, defined as a household who spends more than 30% of their income on rent, remains a major issue for many households in the state. While rent burden has decreased slightly over the last decade, over 50% of all California households are rent burdened, and 25% are extremely rent burdened, spending more than half of their income on housing. If we break down rent burden by income, we see that 91% of households making less than $20,000 per year and 87% of households making less than $50,000 per year are rent burdened. While California's eviction moratorium has been extended until June 30th of this year, tenants are expected to pay back rent in the coming months. And so California is staring down a potential eviction crisis. While COVID-19 has been the largest economic event in recent history, California's housing crisis remains a major economic issue, which was only exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. The onset of the pandemic brought with it so much uncertainty. The uncertainty surrounding the depth and the duration of the disruption had everyone questioning what will happen to the economy. We're losing jobs and we're losing businesses. How bad will it get? And will we ever get back to normal? That leads us to the question of what is normal, and do we really want to go back there? When we started to look at who was actually being impacted, it brought us back to what we discussed at our forecast last year. Last year, we looked beneath the surface of the top line numbers to identify inequity and inequality present in the region, how the then sustained economic growth, full employment, and stock market highs didn't translate into prosperity for all. COVID-19 has only increased the severity of pre-existing challenges and inequalities, and if left unchecked, it may continue to do so for years to come. As we look deeper into who was being impacted by the pandemic, we noticed that certain groups, certain cohorts, and certain types of businesses were being disproportionately impacted. And we're going to go over a few of those groups and cohorts today. Currently, the county, Los Angeles County, has reported over 1 million COVID-19 cases since the onset of the pandemic, with about 1 in every 10 Angelenos having contracted the virus. Racial and ethnic minorities have been disproportionately affected by the virus. Los Angeles County was the first in the nation to report over 1 million COVID cases. And if we look at the people who've contracted the virus, over 60% of cases where the infected individual's race was confirmed has been attributed to Hispanic residents, compared to just 14% for white and about 5% for Asian and Black residents. Next slide. Due to the fast-moving nature of the pandemic's economic impact, we look to unemployment insurance claims filing data as a supplement to traditional labor force and industry employment data, which has a significant data lag. For UI data can act as an early indicator of what may transpire in the labor market prior to the more accurate monthly and quarterly figures publications. From March through December, close to 11.3 million initial UI claims were filed in California. But when we look at the demographic characteristics of the people filing those claims, we see again that youth, the less educated, and people of color were impacted disproportionately, as well as women. When we look at employment trends by income level, we really see a tale of two recoveries. Low-income workers, or those that make less than $27,000 per year, were far likelier to lose their job as a result of the pandemic, with nearly 40% of low-income workers losing their job in April of 2020, compared to 24% of middle income and 13% of high-income workers. While nationwide, the number of high-income jobs has recovered to their pre-pandemic level, low-income jobs are still 25% below that baseline and are trending downward. These jobs, often in service and accommodation sectors, require interpersonal contact and have been unable to operate normally due to public health orders. Within this inequity stems another offshoot of disproportionately affected populations. Many workers in these industries are people of color. As such, minorities have higher levels of unemployment. When looking at age brackets, younger cohorts are 2 to 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed than their older counterparts. And this age-related effect is exacerbated for minority youth. The American Time Use Survey reported that nationwide, working from home was an option for 24.5% of workers with only a high school degree, compared with 67.5% with at least a bachelor's. While 48.7% of non-Hispanic white workers were able to transition to working from home, just 39.5% of Black and 28.9% of Hispanic workers had this ability. Telework jobs are concentrated in knowledge-based industries, in business, financial industry, education, and training, as well as office and administrative support occupations. Jobs that cannot utilize telework are based in production, sales, transportation, and healthcare, to name a few. With a large manufacturing and production base in Los Angeles County, as well as a high degree of emphasis on travel and tourism, entertainment, infrastructure, and retail, a large number of jobs in the region simply cannot be moved online, leading to higher levels of unemployment for workers in these industries. When we look at households with internet availability, and then compare that to concentrations of minority populations and poverty, we see a relationship that highlights the importance of closing the digital divide, especially as work and education they're now remote. Let's take a closer look at those receiving unemployment benefits. The maximum weekly benefit in California is $450 per week. For context, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, defines very low income as 50% of the median family income. And in California, that median family income in 2019 was just over $91,000. Without supplemental benefits, all claimants are below this threshold. And with close to 80% of low-income workers in California estimated to spend more than half their income on rent, for unemployed households, meeting basic needs became much harder with just regular unemployment benefits. The Tale of Two Recoveries applies to businesses as well. Larger businesses typically have greater access to liquidity, which affords them more opportunities to retain employees and remain temporarily closed for longer. The federal government's Paycheck Protection Program attempted to level the playing field by offering small businesses up to $10 million in loans. While intentions were well, many businesses initially were not able to gain access to these loans. In terms of equity, a Brookings report shows even deeper problems with the initial PPP system, as small businesses and communities of color had unequal access to federal COVID-19 relief. It took businesses with paid employees in majority Black zip codes an entire week longer to receive loans than those in majority white communities, and businesses in Latinx communities 6 days longer. Moving forward, governments should look to provide liquidity fairly to all communities, not just those with established banking connections. Women have been dropping out of the labor force during the pandemic. The combination of the lack of childcare options due to closures, the degree of supervision required for online schooling while children are at home, and the high proportion of women working in service sectors heavily impacted by COVID-19 and stay-at-home orders have taken their toll. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Women comprised just over 47% of the labor force in January of 2020, but they accounted for 58% of the 4.3 million people who have dropped out of the labor force between January of 2020 and January of 2021. Just a reminder, an individual must be employed or actively seeking work to be counted as part of the labor force. The novel coronavirus had unprecedented employment impacts across the nation. Employment fell nearly twice as much in response to the stay-at-home orders than what we experienced during the Great Recession. So these negative employment impacts were worse in major U.S. cities, a trend that we also saw in the Great Recession. Many workforce inequities can be better understood when looking at how different industries were impacted by the coronavirus. The leisure and hospitality industry has been entirely upended as the virus diminished demand for travel and recreational activities. Airlines were some of the most affected businesses as revenue passenger miles, a key industry metric, remained down 73% year over year. The trade, transportation, and utility sector also saw huge employment losses as retail trade and passenger transportation plummeted as a result of regional and national stay-at-home orders and travel restrictions worldwide. Personal services and ambulatory healthcare services also fell dramatically as these non-essential businesses were forced to temporarily shut their doors, or in the case of ambulatory healthcare services, much of their visits were transitioned to online telehealth options. Local government budgets were limited in 2020, resulting in the loss of 750,000 government jobs nationwide. Intuitively, those working in the industries that were hardest hit were also disproportionately impacted. Hospitality and retail trade heavily employ youth and people of color. Luckily, with the expedient vaccine rollout in the US, these industries can hopefully begin the recovery process. We see two different experiences when comparing Main Street to Wall Street. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, as with most other major indices, have recovered and surpassed their pre-COVID levels. Meanwhile, revenue from the sale of goods and services remains below its pre-COVID levels. Not to mention unemployment as of January 2021 in the US is 2 times the pre-pandemic level. So stock prices are inherently forward-looking, and so an expedient economic recovery is priced into the index's value. Meanwhile, smaller businesses, namely restaurants and clothing stores, have been struggling. Needless to say, the stock market is not an indicator of the economy at large, especially when it comes to small businesses which lack the same liquidity lines as their larger counterparts. And because I'm an optimist, I like to end on a positive note. One silver lining of COVID-19 could be the introduction of mRNA vaccines for general use. Widely studied but never approved for human use, mRNA vaccines emerged as the leading option to vaccinate against COVID-19. While they operate somewhat differently than conventional vaccines, mRNA still aim to emit the same immune response. Additionally, they can be manufactured faster, cheaper, and safer than conventional vaccines, as they do not require an active or inactive pathogen for production. The 2 most distributed vaccines in the US right now for COVID-19, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, are both mRNA-based. The US leads the world in total number of vaccines administered and is 4th per capita behind Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom. California is moving at a somewhat accelerated pace as well, with over 5 million residents vaccinated, 1 million of which are Los Angeles County residents. In the future, a fully vaccinated population looks to be a necessity in fully opening up service sectors across the US and abroad. A large conversation going forward will be equity in vaccine distribution. Not all countries can afford to vaccinate their entire population, and globally, spikes in developing countries will hamper economic recovery worldwide. On a more local level, if the pandemic is hitting certain communities harder, how can they be adequately supplied with vaccine doses? The economic strength of the last decade was rapidly reversed beginning in March of 2020. As a result of the rising infection rate and the resulting business restrictions, the beginning of 2020 brought dramatic spikes in job losses. The pandemic has had disparate effects on women, people of color, low-wage workers, workers who are young, and with lower levels of education. Small businesses and service sectors have been disproportionately impacted. Looking forward, the next 2 years will be characterized by economic recovery, the speed of which remains tied to the public health crisis. Should the efficacy of the vaccines adhere to the initially published numbers, we estimate that the majority of industries will return to pre-pandemic employment levels by 2024. Achieving herd immunity through vaccination would likely reverse the employment contraction, but population growth and housing accessibility troubled the Golden State long before COVID-19. Going forward, we need to ensure that we continue to allocate time and resources to address California's longstanding challenges so that we are better prepared for the next economic shock. I want to thank you for your time this morning, and I'd like to take a quick moment just to acknowledge the IAE team who worked very hard to prepare this forecast for all of us today. Thank you.
Now, this year, we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by one of the leading minds and voices helping cities and metropolitan areas take actionable next steps to an equitable economic recovery. Amy Liu is Vice President and Director of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program and the Adeline M. and Alfred I. Johnson Chair in Urban and Metropolitan Policy. She's a national expert on cities and metropolitan areas, adept at translating research and insights into action on the ground, excels at linking local experiences to federal policymaking. As director of the Metropolitan Policy Program, which she co-founded, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome the opening keynote now to your digital screens, Amy Liu.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank. And thank you, Bill and the team over at the EDC for giving me the opportunity to join you today. So I was asked to provide a framework for an equitable economic recovery, featuring some promising actions in other communities. Now, the title of this year's forecast report is absolutely right. We have a tale of two recoveries, and the LA region is certainly not alone in confronting this divergence. In fact, across the country, leaders in your peer regions are also trying to rebuild better, more inclusively in the wake of COVID-19. So that is the new competitiveness agenda. The regions that will be world leading will be those that can build a racially inclusive digital economy, where diversity equals dynamism, where talent, not low taxes, will lead to a prosperous future. So what I'm going to do is cover three things today. What it means for the LA region to rebuild better, the structural trends that will impact that vision, and some of those trends are ones that Shannon already shared, and the principles for taking action. So let's start with that vision. So in the wake of COVID-19 and the summer of racial injustices, we at Brookings offered this vision statement, which is that local leaders can rebuild better by investing in Black and Hispanic talent, businesses, and communities in the pursuit of higher quality jobs and wealth creation that leads to lasting prosperity. And that is the opportunity here. And the good news is that the greater LA region enters this moment from a position of strength. This region is already considered one of the nation's superstar cities, as defined by the volume of innovation sector jobs here. And the region also is entering the COVID-19 recession with some progress in economic inclusion. Now, every year, our team puts out what we call the Metro Monitor, which tracks the performance of the nation's largest mid-sized metros in achieving inclusive economic growth. And the latest Metro Monitor for 2021 is actually being released next week. This morning, I am pleased to provide you with an advanced preview of the data and the trends for the greater LA Metro as compared to other superstar metros like New York and Seattle. And on growth, what you see is that the LA economy is expanding, yet job growth over the last 10 years was modest, slightly lagging that among the largest metros in the country. Meanwhile, that growth is leading to better prosperity in terms of better living standards for the broader population, ranking the region 6th out of the 53 largest metros on this score. Yet on inclusion, the income being produced by all the industries in the region is not translating into meaningful wage growth for workers, putting the region 33rd among 53 places on this. And if you look across all these three indicators on growth, prosperity, and inclusion, you'll see that the LA region outperformed New York, but lagged Greater Seattle. Now, if we go deeper on inclusion, the progress is mixed for the LA region. On the left, what you see is that the income gap between whites and people of color actually widened slightly in the past decade, ranking the region 19th among largest metros on racial inequality. This is basically unchanged from last year's monitor. And on the right, on the other hand, the region actually ranked first. In fact, you were the best in improving neighborhood disparities, which means the gaps in the household incomes of people living in the most advantaged neighborhoods versus those in the least advantaged neighborhoods in the LA region actually narrowed quite a bit, thanks to the growth in the incomes of those in the bottom 20% of neighborhoods. And maybe this is in part because of the increase in the minimum wage, which offered a level playing field among the neighborhoods. The bottom line from all of these trends is that I think the efforts by the leaders in this region on this Zoom call are yielding some encouraging progress towards an equitable economy, although I still think obviously there's room for improvement. The concern now is how does COVID-19 and other structural trends impact the near and longer term progress towards an equitable growth? And already Shannon covered some of this, but I want to reinforce this. To start, this region certainly got hit hard by the pandemic. The LA regional economy ended 2020 about 1/10 smaller than at the start of the year, which put the region 48th out of the 53 largest metros in terms of job loss. That translated to a doubling of the unemployment rate, also one of the highest rates among peer metros. And no industries were spared in terms of job loss, although the leisure and hospitality sector was especially vulnerable. And as many of you know, many of the jobs of these jobs involve frontline workers, many of whom are women and workers of color. Now, according to that LAEDC forecast report, the information and financial services sector jobs are predicted to rebound and flourish in the next 2 years, while workers and entrepreneurs and local serving industries will continue to struggle. This is a key aspect of the Tale of Two Recoveries, and it is consistent with the job openings we are seeing in other markets. COVID-19 has definitely accelerated the rise of the digital economy. Bill, talked about this in the beginning of his remarks about how reliant we have become, our households have become, our businesses have become on digital technologies for everything from touchless technologies to online platforms to virtual marketing to online job searches. And now we need the talent also to use these new digital technologies. Now, we believe that leaders in this region can use this COVID-accelerated tech growth and demand for digitally skilled workers as a platform for good jobs, economic mobility, and racial inclusion. And that's because workers with middle to high level skills of technical fluency, they earn more. However, Black and Latino workers are less likely to be employed in these high demand, well-paying digital occupations like computer science specialists. In the LA metropolitan area, what you see here is that Black and Hispanic workers make up 6% and 44% of your overall workforce, respectively. But they are both highly underrepresented in computer math occupations. In fact, what we need is that for Black, Latino, immigrant workers to represent a proportionate share of jobs in the growing parts of the economy. Okay, so that was jobs in the labor market. What I now want to focus on is the geography of opportunity within our metropolitan areas post-COVID. Now, most fundamentally, prior to the pandemic, the digital economy was demanding density. And I don't see that changing anytime soon at all. Knowledge jobs, knowledge workers, they concentrate in particular metros, and within metropolitan areas, our evidence shows that they also favor urban counties and vibrant neighborhoods, which means cities like LA will do just fine. The industries that are most likely to cluster at that neighborhood level are a mix of high-end and low-wage service jobs, such as information and professional services, retail, headquarters. These sectors are demanding dense locations, whether it's in innovation districts, medical districts, retail districts, which gather talent, related firms, and other assets in these small quality places. Now, as you all consider opportunities to add more job density, housing density, clustered job opportunities for employers and workers, and hopefully connected by transit, by the way, what I find interesting is that pre-COVID, the office market here in the greater LA region was a bit soft. According to CoStar data, office vacancy rates for the Los Angeles region right before the pandemic, at the close of 2019, stood at 9.5%, a higher office vacancy rate than in the New York, Miami, and Philadelphia metropolitan areas. The most vacant submarket in the LA region was downtown, followed by Koreatown, which means this to me is a sign of the pre-COVID vulnerabilities in a major employment center and a neighborhood commercial corridor. Now, there's been lots of concerns about the impact of remote work and hybrid work on the future of downtowns, but I also want to remind you that the future of local serving businesses like restaurants and other merchants will also impact neighborhood employment centers. What's gut-wrenching for me is that more than 1/3 of small businesses in the Los Angeles region have already closed since January of last year, ranking the region 45th among the 50 largest metros on this front. And what we know is nationally, Latino, Black, immigrant entrepreneurs were the most vulnerable to business closures at the start of pandemic. And they actually had less cash on hand going into this crisis, which now impacts their family wealth and again impacts neighborhoods. I want to further accentuate the spatial dimension of the small business crisis. This chart from our friends at the Economic Innovation Group, EIG, shows that more than half of the nation's small business recovery 5 years after the Great Recession took place in mostly prosperous zip codes. The least advantaged neighborhoods lost neighborhood businesses. So when we talk about the demand for density, even by retailers, what we're seeing is that density is not benefiting all neighborhoods in our community. So in short, COVID-19 and the structural trends has been quite disruptive to LA's path to a more equitable economic future. So what can leaders do now to double down on equitable recovery? Now, in my essay on Rebuild Better, my colleagues and I laid out 3 simple principles of action. 1, you have to set explicit goals towards higher quality jobs and job pathways that improve incomes and wealth for households by race and geography. It's really hard to achieve what you don't measure. 2, adopt a holistic framework to pursue those goals with an emphasis on quality jobs, skilled people, and connected places. And your new pathways for economic resiliency does reflect this kind of agenda. And 3rd, build new civic muscle and institutional capacities. Achieving an equitable recovery requires changing norms, making equity a culture shift, partnering differently, ceding power to a new generation of leaders and organizations to drive change, creating new tables or institutions to fill key gaps. So let me talk about to set goals. San Diego is a great example of this. Like Los Angeles, San Diego is a superstar region. It has world-class research, commercialization, a startup ecosystem. It's also a binational region with a rapidly growing Latino population. So led by the Greater San Diego EDC, its major employers, community colleges, local governments, unions, community nonprofits came together to set 3 big, hairy goals to advance an inclusive economy and now a recovery. This is how they're focusing their efforts. They're committed to locally produce 20,000 new skilled workers by 2030, of which 7,200 must be in software-related positions and reach more workers of color. B, they are creating 50,000 quality, good-paying jobs. How? By scaling up small businesses and startups so those firms have the capacity to pay better wages and offer benefits to workers. And 3, they are aiming to create 75,000 new thriving households and families who can afford the rising costs of housing, transportation, and childcare in the region. Leaders in San Diego are implementing employer partnership initiatives and some policy campaigns to move the needle on these 3 big goals. Now, on a holistic agenda. The Cincinnati business community is a good example of a place that has launched a program aimed at scaling mid-sized Black and Latino businesses as a source of quality job creation. The focus on mid-sized firms with at least $1 million in revenue is intentional. These companies are often overlooked. They have the capacity to grow. They can forge supplier relationships with incumbent firms. They can pay good salaries for other workers of color, and they generate sustained wealth and opportunities for the owner. The program provides critical business services, access to capital, and customer relationships. And to date, this program has helped nearly 70 minority-owned businesses grow and collectively generate 3,500 new jobs. Similarly, there's a coalition of CEOs with the mayor in Birmingham, Alabama, that are diversifying their vendor and supplier relationships. This is the demand side of the Cincinnati example I just gave. Now, nationally, private sector supplier diversity is absolutely abysmal. One national report found that only 3% of Fortune 500 procurement benefited Black businesses. In response, these major employers in the Birmingham area have committed to collect and make transparent their procurement data as a first step in awareness, in tracking, and reforms to vendor relationships. On skills development, I like this mission led by Virginia Ready, which is a new nonprofit intermediary created in the wake of COVID-19. Virginia Ready has forged partnerships with over 20 leading employers and 23 community colleges in this crisis. The program gives unemployed workers, those that have been displaced from restaurant industry, retail, airport facilities, they give these unemployed workers $1,000 in tuition assistance to pay for certified training programs that line up to the job openings in growing fields like healthcare, business services, and IT. In short, this is a cross-sector partnership that helps vulnerable workers, many workers of color, transition to good jobs in expanding industries. And on vibrant connected places, I wanted to give you an example from Portland. A nonprofit developer in this community created a community investment trust, like a REIT, that enables local residents to literally buy back the block, giving them a chance to invest in redevelopments in their own neighborhoods, which we'll need to do more of given the collapse in the commercial sector and commercial corridors. Nearly 200 residents invested anywhere from $10 to $100 a month in this trust in the redevelopment of a vacant plaza. More than half of these neighborhood investors earned less than $40,000 a year. 62% were women, 49% were born outside of the United States. And then local community foundations, corporations, and banks co-invested in the trust with the residents. By the end of 2019, thanks to strong resident support of the tenants in that retail strip, the trust has delivered to resident investors 3 years of dividend returns at an average rate of 9.3% interest. So not bad. And finally, here are just some examples of how to build new civic muscle and capacity to advance an equitable recovery. In Indianapolis, the Indy Chamber there, which also acts like the regional EDC, has adopted an inclusive economic growth strategy in which DEI is embedded across their existing economic development programs. For instance, they launched an inclusive incentives program, which rewards only those firms that pay a living wage, offer benefits, and invest in programs that remove barriers to work, such as training, childcare, and transit. They have a partnership with the Department of Corrections to help returning citizens launch new businesses. And during the pandemic, they've been serving as a CDFI, helping small businesses overlooked by traditional banks to access loans and technical services. And finally, Portland Means Progress is a new collaboration among economic development, the city, workforce intermediaries, to ensure that Portland now stands for 3 things: They stand for strong, homegrown, diverse workforce through internships and apprenticeships. They stand for diverse small businesses through supplier diversity programs. And they stand for workplace culture, diversity, equity, inclusion through DEI services they provide to member companies. And you can find these and other emerging best practices and data resources on our COVID-19 Metro Recovery Watch page, which is dedicated to leaders like you who are interested in actions towards an equitable recovery. In closing, let me just remind you of this. The new economic competitiveness agenda is economic equity. It is diversity as dynamism. It is shared prosperity. So in this race for economic inclusion, I hope LA gets to be at the head of the pack. Thank you.
Now going to have the honor and pleasure of introducing for the second part of the program, the COO, Stephen Cheung.
Thank you all for joining. Shannon was able to set the stage in terms of what's happening in California and Los Angeles. And with Amy, your presentation really gave us a really good insights. You know, took a lot of notes. I was going to ask you a lot of questions about this as well, in terms of things that are happening in Virginia and Portland in particular, with the forged partnership with the $1,000 subsidy so that we can actually help our workforce get trained up. We've been here in the region really struggling in terms of how do we make sure that the displaced workers have a future? How do we basically set them up and line them up to partner with our community college districts? We've been doing work with the Center for Competitive Workforce, and as Bill had mentioned before, we've been working with the county on creating this report to really understand what we need to do next. So there's still a lot to talk about, and unfortunately we won't have time today to go into the details. So hopefully our audience will continue to engage with us and ask these questions. And what we're hoping to do, Amy, if you're okay with this, is to bring you back to Los Angeles so that we can have a number of these discussions and get the best practices so we can learn how to proceed. To be honest with you, there's been a lot of tension that's been brewing because of COVID-19 and because of this racial, gender, and income gap that's been growing and growing. And also between the private sector and also the public sector and governments, has been more and more tension that's been brewing. So we wanted to talk more about that, and we hope to invite you back to help us guide us through some best practices so that as a region, like you said, we can lead the pack and we can lead the way in the future. And as our team put their head together on how to best frame the conversation of an equitable recovery amidst this pandemic in the context of our region, we knew that we need to bring in a closing keynote speaker who can help take this conversation to applicable next steps. How can we, as educators, as business leaders, as policymakers, and as community leaders, take a lead to ensure a more inclusive recovery? And that's why we're delighted that Bruce Katz was able to join us and provide the closing keynote for us. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Katz is the founding director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And previously, he served as an inaugural Centennial Scholar at Brookings Institution and as the vice president and director of Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program for 20 years. He's a visiting professor in practice at London School of Economics and previously served as chief of staff to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and staff director of the Senate Subcommittee on Housing and Urban Affairs. Mr. Katz co-led the Obama administration's Housing and Urban Transition Team. He's a co-author of the Metropolitan Revolution and the New Localism, How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism. With this illustrious background, we're so delighted Bruce is able to join us to provide us with the closing to really give us a bit better context in terms of, okay, what's next? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Bruce. Bruce, the stage is yours.
Stephen, thanks for that introduction, and it's great to be with everyone today. And I know you heard from Amy, who's a close partner with me over many decades, actually. So I'm going to go to the next slide and really try to talk about how you move from a concept to action in this year of relief and recovery. Amy went through the data to a much greater extent than I will, but obviously we're experiencing the largest economic shock since the Great Depression. With our focus at Drexel on this devastating impact back in Latino-owned business and the decimation of many commercial corridors and main streets within which they are located. But this provides an opportunity because of the Biden administration and the change in Congress for cities. It's the largest opportunity with federal investment really since the New Deal Just think about Amazon HQ2 on steroids, and you have a sense of what's coming down the pike here. And what that requires is for cities to think very intentionally and purposefully, cities, counties, business, philanthropy, universities, nonprofits, about how you align and prioritize federal investments in ways that really fit your economy. So the election, and particularly the Georgia races and the cementing of Democratic control of the U.S. Senate, has really completely changed the game. We now have leaders in the House, leaders in the Senate, and the Biden-Harris administration who understand cities and urban counties, who understand the panoply of challenges that present in these places, and have governed like Mayor Pete or Mayor Walsh or Governor Raimondo or Governor Granholm in ways that really knit together infrastructure with innovation, with workforce development, with small business. So this is a government, both in the House and the Senate and in the administration, who understand urban places and the fact that we are a metropolitan nation. So this is a sea change, obviously, dramatic sea change. What's coming is going to be stages of relief and recovery. We all have the December package, the $900 billion that flowed in at the end of December, enacted at the end of December, which was principally focused towards unemployment, direct checks to families and individuals, and more business relief through the Paycheck Protection Program. But now we're cycling into larger packages. First, President Biden's $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, which will provide more relief for state and local governments, accelerated vaccination program, a school reopening support, less support for small business because that was in the December package. And after that, as we begin to move through this year, more typical counter-cyclical investments in innovation, infrastructure, and human capital. So as I go through this, the bottom line, the major message is get ready because the funding is coming. The American Rescue Plan with President Biden is, the next slide will sort of tease out, is again focused on challenges that were not addressed at the end of last year. Remember, there was a call for $2,000 checks. They ended up being $600. They'll make up the difference. But there also wasn't a relief for state and local governments. And what we've learned in the past Great Recession is that if we do not provide support for state and local governments, the recession will be prolonged. So that's critical. School funding is critical. Some more small business relief for transit. So that's coming, and that should pass probably by early to mid-March. And again, watch this state and local relief because it's very flexible. It will go directly to cities and counties and states, and it could open up more investment possibilities locally. Next slide. But then we get to the stimulus package. And the stimulus package will make a series of investments, fairly typical counter-cyclical investments to back better, frankly. Innovation. So innovation will be investments through traditional research agencies like NIH or NSF or the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy. But it will also focus on manufacturing, which is critical in LA County because of the port, because of the airport. You're still a major manufacturing center in the United States. And it will also focus on new technology hubs, what we would call innovation districts that co-locate advanced research with mature companies, with startup and scale-ups, with incubators and accelerators. Innovation, a key plank. Next slide. Infrastructure will be a major part of this package. It will not be traditional infrastructure, just roads, bridges, rail, transit. We're talking about a greening of the American energy sector, major investments in broadband, substantial investments in school modernization and school transformation, and the transformation, frankly, of the auto industry towards electric vehicles. If you look at the New York Times today, major article about what that will mean for battery innovation. So infrastructure across multiple asset classes, multiple dimensions. Next slide. I caught the end of a on workforce development. It is so critical that we see major investments in human capital because technological innovation, which is sweeping across manufacturing, healthcare, the services sector, artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data analysis, software engineering. I think we're going to see major investments in community colleges for the credentialing of workers to enter these next generation sectors and technologies. So workforce development programs for sure, but also community colleges because they work so closely with business clusters. Next slide. And then finally, this is a piece that actually hasn't really been teased out yet. Traditionally, there has been major investments in community redevelopment. We saw some of that last year with investments in the CDFI fund. Community development finance institutions were so critical to make sure that the program got to Black and Brown-owned businesses that tended to be underbanked, undercapitalized. So CDFI has got substantial funding. EDA, the Economic Development Administration, got about $1.5 billion last year. They're probably going to get $3 billion in this American Rescue Plan. That could be critical for both innovation and for small businesses. But I think there's going to be more coming here around larger scale community redevelopment, urban land banks, home ownership. So watch this space because it's being developed really as we speak. Next slide. So the question really for cities as you begin to think about this is not about just receiving funding, but deploying funding in a way that maximizes inclusive outcomes. So that partly from a business perspective, that means supplier diversity, procurement policy, so that you can match up the purchasing of goods and services with Black and Latino owned businesses. Absolutely critical. New source of business demand. Diverse hiring, upgrading the skills, Black, Latino, Asian, and other workers, because that's critical to make sure that these individuals have access, have the skills, capacity, the capabilities to enter into the labor market with latitude of opportunity, better paying jobs, better benefits. And finally, community redevelopment itself, because many of the investments around infrastructure or innovation will be needed areas of high poverty. So the key is how do you leverage that up to have the largest wealth building effect for residents living in these communities. So it's not just about getting the funds or even getting ready for the funds. It's about deploying funds in an effective way. So what we're basically beginning to tease out is how do cities and counties harness these large federal resources, unprecedented federal resources, because the national government tends to focus or operate through silos and stovepipes. The Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, HUD, Housing and Urban Development. So it's really these vertical compartmentalized bureaucracies. When they come to ground, these funds need to be braided and blended together so that they have a 2 + 2 = 5 effect. That they have the kind of inclusive and sustainable outcomes that we want. That's the role of cities and counties, not just government, but government in close collaboration with the business sector, philanthropy, universities, community groups, and others. So what we're working on now are what we're calling, and this phrase will probably change, stimulus command centers, where you literally declare your priorities locally and then begin to harness federal investments around those priorities. This is a bottom-up recovery when you think about how the United States is actually organized, with cities and counties and metropolitan areas really the units of the domestic and global economy. So how do we think this will sort of play out? In Philadelphia, what we're doing is anticipating that federal funds will flow to multiple kinds of infrastructure. We're literally interviewing every single public authority, for the most part, that controls decisions about these funds, the port, the airport, the Department of Transportation, the commuter rail, the transit system, the public utility in Philadelphia, so that we can understand, well, what are the current priorities that exist? And most of the public authorities have boards which have been appointed by the mayor or the county executives, or in which elected officials actually sit together to make allocation decisions. So what are the current priorities? Are they aligned with market dynamics? Do they have the biggest inclusive outcome? Have people really thought through the deployment issues I talked about before? So basically getting ready means to talk to decision makers, essentially, and influencers who will be the places where money flows through. So that's what we're doing in Philly to get ready. And ultimately, as we begin to see these stimulus command centers be created, they will declare metropolitan plans of priorities. In Philadelphia, after about a month of these conversations, what's become very clear across public, private, and civic stakeholders is school modernization, school transformation, 21st century learning environments where high schools and community colleges are co-located. That seems the one driving priority that really unifies everyone. In Detroit and some other cities I've been working with, interestingly enough, what they're focused on is land reclamation of large parcels, environmental remediation to get prepared for next generation manufacturing. In Detroit, not surprising, given what General Motors has said, electric vehicles, since that is going to be where the auto sector ultimately moves, or even charging stations. So each city and metropolitan area, particularly the large ones, they do have ubiquitous challenges, but they have distinctive competitive advantages and assets. And the key here is to try to line up what makes your place special and what you're prioritizing to the funding that's coming, make sure it's coming, but also make sure it's coming in a form where you can maximize its deployment. And we may be, well, the only issue here is always in America, someone's doing something, right? Someone's taking the lead. What I have found is a group of business organizations in particular, not surprisingly, have begun to take the lead on areas of policy within their remit. Tends to be innovation, infrastructure, more probably public-private controlled, but innovation very much universities, advanced companies, and so forth. So in Cleveland and St. Louis and in Cincinnati, you're seeing a lot of focus on that, but always in the service of growing Black and Latino-owned small businesses. And then in other cities, like Louisville, like Dayton, like Birmingham, like Philadelphia, mayors are trying to be the conveners so they can pull everyone together and really try to push forward almost like a city investment guide to guide both the feds, but also to guide local action. And I think we may be close to the end. So, my main message here is as predictable as anything else in this crazy period. Federal investments are coming. They will only be as effective as local implementation. If we've learned anything since this virus has started, is the federal government can send resources out, hopefully provide guidance based on science, but cities and counties and states are the places that actually have to execute and deliver and implement. And so federal programs and policies are really only as effective as local implementation. And so my message today is create your version of a command center for this tremendous county and city and metropolis in which you live, and really harness and leverage these investments for long-term transformative effect. And with that, I'll stop.
Bruce, thank you so very much for your presentation, for being with us today. You've given us a great challenge as a region. We have made an initial start at this with a report we published last week called Pathways for Economic Prosperity, and on a specific area around the digital divide in terms of being ready for the federal investments that are coming. The LAEDC and our partners at Unite LA, the City of LA, the County of LA, UCLA, USC, The Committee for Greater LA, the California Community Foundation, and dozens of others have formed a Digital Equity Action League to focus not only on broadband infrastructure, but affordable rate plans, digital literacy, so that we can direct whatever federal, state, or local funds may be available to connect everyone to the internet. Because we believe we're never going to have a truly 21st century economy taking full advantage of all the digital technologies unless we focus on equity in the connections to that digital economy and ensure that everyone here is connected. But your remarks, Amy's remarks, the remarks of our panelists, I popped into a couple of the breakout sessions, have given us a tremendous amount of food for thought and a real significant challenge here. If we are to create a truly inclusive economic recovery, we have a lot of work yet to do here in LA County. But we're energized by the challenge. We're grateful for your insights. We're grateful to all of our speakers today, to all of our sponsors who made these conversations possible. We know we had some technical glitches earlier in the program, and we're going to get some of the presentations out to you in a little more refined format, as well as the forecast report itself and the speakers' various slides. This is a great community in Los Angeles. We have a lot of civic stewards here who are committed to helping rebuild this economy in a truly inclusive way so that everyone here can fully participate in the benefits of this nation-sized economy that Los Angeles County is proud of. Thank you all. We know we're over time, so I'm going to cut any final remarks short, but just ask you all to continue to engage with the LAEDC as we digest what we've learned today, as we work through our committees and collaborative partnerships throughout the region on internalizing and activating so much of the valuable content that was shared with us today. We have a lot of work to do. As I said at the beginning, this is a tale of two recoveries. Some folks have recovered fully, others are on a very long, slow path to recovery, and it's incumbent upon all of us as civic stewards and leaders to focus our attention on those folks, on our neighbors who have a longer path to recovery. You've heard wonderful ideas today about investments in workforce training and reskilling and upskilling, about investments in commercial corridors and disadvantaged communities, about investments in infrastructure, in housing, in wage supports, in childcare and elder care, on and on and on. Let's digest this together as a community. Let's make our priorities. And let's get to work ensuring a fully inclusive, equitable economic recovery for all of our neighbors throughout Los Angeles County and beyond. Thank you all for being with us for our 2021 annual economic forecast. Please enjoy the networking session that's now available. The use of this lunch pool platform was designed to give you all some time to network and discuss what you heard today, maybe form some initial conversations and working groups on how you might join us in ensuring this equitable economic recovery for all in Los Angeles. Thank you all for being with us.